Everyone in town said it was a strange match. A proud rancher, known for his stubborn ways, forced to marry the woman everyone whispered about, the so-called old maid. People laughed behind their hands, saying it was a punishment, not a wedding. They said he'd been too proud for too long, and now fate was teaching him a lesson. But no one could imagine how that lesson would turn out. The rancher's name carried weight across the valley. He was a man who built his life with his own hands, who didn't take orders from anyone. The kind of man who believed love should come on his own terms, not from town gossip or family pressure. When he heard that he'd have to marry a woman chosen by others, he felt cornered, humiliated even. It wasn't just a marriage to him, it was a blow to his pride. He told himself he'd never give his heart to a woman chosen by anyone but himself. And then there was her, quiet, plain, and older than most brides. She'd lived her life being the helper, the caretaker, the one left behind when all her friends married and moved away. People called her the old maid like it was her name, like she didn't have dreams or feelings of her own. She didn't fight back when they mocked her. She just smiled softly and went on with her day. No one really noticed her strength, they only saw what they wanted to see. On the day of the wedding, the air felt thick with curiosity. Neighbors gathered, pretending to celebrate, but really they came to watch the show. Some whispered that the rancher looked angry enough to ride off before the vows. Others pitied the bride, standing there so calm, so still, as if she had accepted her fate long before the day came. When they said their "I do's," there was no smile, no joy, just duty. After the ceremony, the rancher tipped his hat and walked ahead without a word. She followed, silent but steady, to the home that would now be hers too. The town watched them ride away, certain this marriage was doomed from the start. But life, as it often does, had a way of proving everyone wrong. The rancher had always been a man of few words and firm beliefs. He rose before the sun, worked until the stars appeared, and believed that everything in life should be earned, not handed to you. His name was John Mercer, a man who had built his ranch from dust and sweat. Every fence post, every cattle brand, every acre, it all came from his own backbreaking effort. He was proud of that. Too proud, some said. But in a land where only the strong survived, pride was a kind of armor. John never cared for what the town thought. He had his land, his horses, and his freedom. That was enough. He didn't need small talk, and he didn't have time for love. People said women had tried before, young widows, pretty daughters from nearby farms, but none stayed long. He had no patience for giggles or soft words. He wanted peace, not chatter. So when the town council decided to help him by arranging a marriage, he took it as an insult more than anything else. It had started as gossip. Some said the rancher was getting too old to live alone. Others whispered that he'd become too rough, too cold. They claimed that a woman's touch might soften him. What none of them knew was that John's solitude was his choice. Years ago, he'd been in love once, but the woman he thought he'd marry chose another man. After that, something in him closed off. He built walls around his heart as strong as the fences around his land. When the town preacher told him about the plan, John laughed, a short, bitter sound that carried no humor. "You think I'll marry because you tell me to?" he asked. But the preacher wasn't joking. There was pressure from the town elders, a mix of tradition and pity. They said a man like him shouldn't die alone, that the land needed a family name to continue, that he owed it to the community. The more they insisted, the more his anger grew. But in the end, resistance brought him nothing but trouble. If he refused, he'd risk losing favor, and in a small town that meant losing business, supplies, even trust. So he agreed, but with a heart full of resentment. When he first heard the name of his bride, he barely reacted. He knew of her, of course. Everyone did. Sarah Weller, the woman left behind by time. She was known for her quiet ways, for helping the sick, for mending clothes and baking bread for neighbors. But she was older, plain-looking, and in the eyes of the town, long past the age for love. John didn't care. If he had to marry someone, it may as well be someone who wouldn't expect much. In truth, he planned to treat it like a business deal. She'd have food, shelter, a name. In return, she'd keep the house and stay out of his way. That was all. He told himself it was fair. But deep down, he felt something heavy, not guilt exactly, but something close. The first days after the wedding were quiet, too quiet. He kept to the barn, fixing tools, mending fences, pretending the house didn't exist. When he came inside for meals, the table was always neatly set, food warm and ready, but he never said much beyond a quick nod. She didn't press him for talk, didn't question where he went or how long he stayed. She just carried on sweeping, cooking, tending to small things around the house. It almost irritated him, her calmness, her silence. He had expected tears, complaints, maybe even arguments. But Sarah never gave him that satisfaction. She seemed at peace with her new life, as if she'd expected this kind of coldness all along. That quiet strength made him uneasy. Sometimes late at night, John found himself wondering what she thought of him. Was she angry? Was she lonely? He'd catch glimpses of her sitting by the small lamp, sewing or reading, her face soft in the glow. There was something steady about her, something he couldn't name. She didn't seem broken or bitter, and that confused him. One morning he found her outside feeding the chickens, her sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back. She was humming a tune soft, almost too quiet to hear. For a moment he just watched. There was nothing graceful or grand about her, but something in that small, ordinary scene stirred him. He quickly turned away, annoyed with himself for noticing. Days turned to weeks. Slowly, the house began to change. The air felt less heavy. She cleaned the corners that had gathered dust for years. She organized the pantry, fixed the leaky roof in the kitchen, even planted flowers by the porch. He didn't ask her to, she just did it. He pretended not to care. But when he saw those flowers bloom, he felt something unfamiliar. Warmth. One evening, after a long day fixing a broken fence, he came home to find the table set again. But this time there was stew, rich, hot, and seasoned just right. "You didn't have to," he muttered, half grateful, half defensive. She simply smiled and said, "You've been working hard, you should eat." That night he ate in silence, but it was the first real meal he'd enjoyed in months. Something began to shift quietly, like wind changing direction. He started noticing small details, the way she folded his shirts, the way she cared for the animals when he was gone, the way her presence softened the house. He didn't understand it and he didn't want to, but it was happening. At times, guilt would creep in. He remembered how angry he'd been when the town forced him into marriage, how he'd sworn never to care. Yet here she was, never asking for love, never demanding anything, just doing what needed to be done. And somehow, her silence spoke louder than any argument could. John told himself not to think too much about it. He focused on work, on the land, on anything but her. But no matter how far he rode, his mind kept returning to that small, calm figure in his kitchen, the woman who, without saying a word, had begun to change everything. Sarah Weller had long grown used to being overlooked. In a small town like theirs, women's lives were measured by who they married and how many children they bore. Sarah had neither. Her youth had passed quietly, spent caring for her sick mother until the old woman's final days. By the time Sarah could think about herself, the world around her had already moved on. Her friends had families, her neighbors had grown children, and she remained the woman who never caught a husband. The town gave her a name, the old maid asterisk, and with time, that label settled around her like dust that no one bothered to brush away. Still, she lived her life with quiet purpose. She helped where she could, mended torn shirts, baked for the church, tended the ill. She never expected much in return, and perhaps that was her strength. Expecting nothing meant she was never disappointed. But inside her, there was still a heart that wanted to be seen. Not pitied, not mocked, just asterisk seen asterisk. When word came that the town wanted her to marry John Mercer, she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She had known John from a distance. Everyone did. He was the man with the hard eyes and sunburned skin, the one who never smiled unless he was with his horses. People respected him, but they didn't love him. He kept to himself, a man who lived by the land and answered to no one. So when the town decided he needed a wife and she was chosen, Sarah could only assume it was because no one else wanted the job. She wasn't a fool. She knew how the town worked. They thought she'd be grateful for any chance at marriage, even one built from pity. But Sarah didn't see it that way. She didn't want pity. She wanted peace. And maybe, in a strange way, she thought marrying John might give her just that, a roof, a purpose, a place to belong. She didn't expect kindness from him. She certainly didn't expect love. But she told herself that even if the marriage was born from duty, she could still bring warmth into the cold corners of his life. It was in her nature to care, even when no one asked her to. On their wedding day, Sarah walked down the aisle in a simple dress she had sewn herself. There were no flowers, no lace, no crowd of adoring eyes. The preacher's words echoed through the church while she focused on steadying her breath. She didn't look at John until the vows were spoken. When she finally did, she saw a man made of stone, tall, still, eyes fixed straight ahead. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched behind his back. She felt the sting of embarrassment but held her head high. It wasn't love that brought them there, but she would not let shame take her dignity. After the ceremony, she followed him to his ranch, a wide stretch of land under the endless sky. The house stood firm but tired, much like the man himself. When he dismounted and walked ahead without a word, Sarah waited a moment before stepping down. The silence between them was sharp, but she didn't let it cut her. She knew better than to fill space with meaningless talk. That night, she unpacked her things in the small room he pointed her to. It wasn't much, a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a window looking out at the pasture. She didn't cry. She just sat there for a long while, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the creak of the house. In that moment, she made herself a promise. If this was to be her life, she would make it a good one. The next morning, she rose early. The smell of dust and horses drifted in through the open window. She put on her apron and made breakfast, eggs, bread, and coffee. John entered without a word, nodded once, and sat. She served him quietly, then stepped back. He didn't thank her, but she didn't expect him to. She could tell gratitude wasn't something he gave easily. Over the following days, she learned his rhythms. He left before dawn and returned when the sun dipped low. He spoke little, his voice low and clipped when he did. But Sarah watched the way he fed his horses before himself, how he fixed his tools with steady patience, how he never wasted movement. There was strength in him, but also loneliness. When she found small things undone, a torn curtain, a squeaky door hinge, unwashed clothes, she tended to them without asking. Slowly, the house began to shift. The dust disappeared. The air smelled faintly of soap and wood polish. Meals appeared on time, hot and hearty. The man who had lived years without comfort now found his home quietly changing, even if he didn't acknowledge it. Some evenings, when he came in from the fields, he found her sitting by the fire, mending a shirt or reading. The glow of the lamp caught the edges of her hair, turning silver strands into soft light. He rarely spoke, but he noticed. And when he looked away, it wasn't because he didn't see, it was because he didn't know how to. The town, of course, watched too. Some people said she was lucky to have a roof and a husband, even if he barely spoke to her. Others whispered that she'd made a mistake, that no good could come from marrying a man who didn't love her. But Sarah paid them no mind. She'd lived long enough to know that people always talk, especially when they're unhappy with their own lives. Instead, she poured herself into small acts of care. She tended a tiny garden behind the house, growing herbs and flowers. She baked bread every Sunday, filling the kitchen with warmth. She even started keeping a small notebook, a quiet record of each day. Not for anyone else, just for herself. Little by little, she built a life that felt steady, even if it wasn't full of joy. And though John said nothing, something inside him began to shift. He noticed how the house no longer felt cold when he returned. He noticed how the animals seemed calmer around her. He noticed the way her presence softened the silence that had once pressed heavy on his shoulders. He didn't know what to make of it or of her, but he couldn't deny that she was changing things. Sarah never tried to win him over. She simply existed with quiet grace, moving through his world like sunlight through dusty windows, gentle, unassuming, yet impossible to ignore. And while he tried to keep his distance, the truth was simple. The longer she stayed, the harder it became for him to remember what his life had been before her. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life on the ranch began to take shape. The land was wide, quiet, and honest. It asked for everything a man could give, and in return, it revealed who he truly was. For John Mercer, it had always been his world, a place where he didn't need to talk or pretend. But now, that world had someone else moving through it, someone who didn't fit the silence, yet didn't break it either. Sarah didn't try to change him. She didn't try to change the ranch. She simply became a part of it. Her footsteps blended into the sound of the wind and the rustle of hay. Each morning, she woke before him and had the fire going by the time he came in from the barn. The smell of coffee filled the house before the sun had even broken the horizon. She never asked him questions, never made small talk, but she always looked up when he walked in, a brief, gentle glance that somehow softened the start of his day. At first, he barely noticed. He was used to long hours of work fixing fences, breaking horses, hauling supplies. But slowly he began to see the quiet ways she changed the place. The kitchen, once dull and cold, now felt warm. The table was always clean, and there was always a simple meal waiting. She had even hung curtains, pale ones that caught the light and moved gently in the breeze. It was such a small thing, but when he saw them for the first time, he stopped and stared longer than he meant to. Sarah, for her part, kept busy without complaint. She didn't tire easily. When the laundry line broke, she fixed it herself. When the chicken coop needed mending, she found the hammer and set to work. Once he caught her trying to lift a sack of grain that was clearly too heavy. He watched her from a distance, a small woman against the weight of the world, and before he could think, he was there, taking the bag from her hands. She looked up, startled, and for a brief moment their eyes met. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice was calm, steady. He only grunted in reply, embarrassed by his own impulse to help, but something about that tiny moment lingered. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen, not as the hard rancher everyone respected from afar, but as a man standing in front of a woman who wasn't afraid of him. Over time, she began to step outside more. She fed the chickens, tended to the small garden she had planted behind the house, and sometimes stood watching the horses with quiet admiration. One afternoon, John noticed her by the corral, her hands resting on the fence as she watched a young colt run in circles. "He's wild," John said, walking up beside her. "He's beautiful," she replied. Her tone was gentle, not dreamy or soft, just honest. It caught him off guard. Most people spoke to him with either fear or flattery, but she spoke as if he were just another soul passing by. For some reason, that made him want to stay a little longer. That evening, while he was brushing down the horses, she appeared at the barn door holding a lantern. "You missed supper," she said, setting the light on a beam. "Figured you might be hungry later." "I'm fine," he muttered, not looking up. "I left a plate on the table anyway." Then she left just like that, no argument, no fuss. When he came in hours later, the plate was still warm under a towel. He sat down, eating in silence, but the simple gesture settled deep inside him. The days grew longer as summer stretched on. The work was endless, long rides, broken fences, and a heat that pressed down hard. Yet somehow it all felt different now. There was someone waiting at the end of the day. The loneliness that used to echo through the house had faded into something softer. One morning, he came in early and found her standing at the window, holding a cup of tea. The light touched her face, and he realized for the first time how tired she must have been, all those early mornings, all that work without a word of complaint. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. So instead, he poured himself coffee and sat nearby. It was a quiet breakfast, but not an empty one. When autumn came, the wind turned sharp and the nights colder. Sarah began sewing quilts from old fabric scraps, her hands moving steadily by the firelight. John would sit nearby, repairing harnesses or sharpening tools. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It felt like understanding. One night, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the valley, shaking the windows and rattling the barn doors. John grabbed his coat and lantern, heading out to check the animals. Sarah followed him to the porch, her voice rising over the storm. "Be careful," she called out. When he came back soaked and shivering, she was waiting with a towel and a steaming pot of soup. "You're lucky you didn't catch cold," she said as he sat by the fire. He muttered something about being fine, but she only smiled and ladled soup into a bowl. The warmth of it spread through him, not just from the food, but from the simple act of being cared for. That night he lay awake listening to the rain. It had been years since anyone had worried about him. He'd forgotten what that felt like. The next morning, when he saw her outside feeding the chickens, he hesitated before stepping out. He watched as she brushed the rain off her sleeves and hummed softly to herself. It wasn't a song he knew, but it settled something inside him. For the first time, he realized how much her presence had become a part of the ranch, part of him. He didn't say it. He didn't even let himself think it fully. But deep down, the truth was growing quietly, like roots spreading under the surface. The woman the town had mocked, the woman he'd been forced to marry, had somehow brought warmth into a life that had been cold for too long. And though he wouldn't have admitted it out loud, he knew the ranch wasn't just his anymore. It was theirs. Winter came early that year. The cold crept in through the cracks of the old house, and frost lay heavy across the fields each morning. The ranch, once humming with summer life, now felt quiet and watchful. John worked harder than ever, rising before dawn to break the ice on the water troughs, checking fences that snapped under the weight of snow. Sarah kept the house alive, feeding the fire, warming meals, mending his gloves when the leather split. The days were long and silent, but there was a kind of rhythm to them now, steady, familiar, almost comforting. One afternoon, the sky turned gray, thick clouds rolling in from the west. John knew what that meant. A storm was coming, the kind that could bury cattle alive if he didn't move them fast. He hitched up his horse without a word, gathering rope and tools, his face set like stone. Sarah met him at the door, her hands clutching his coat. "You can't go alone," she said quietly. "I've done this before," he muttered, pulling on his gloves. "It's worse this time," she warned, looking toward the dark horizon. "At least let me help you pack the supplies." He hesitated, just long enough for her to start filling a small sack, food, a blanket, a flask of coffee. Her hands moved quickly, steady despite the rising wind outside. When she handed it to him, he finally looked at her, really looked. There was fear in her eyes, but also something stronger, something unspoken that reached straight through him. He nodded once. "I'll be back before morning." But morning came, and he didn't. The storm hit harder than anyone expected. Wind screamed across the land, snow piling against the doors, rattling windows until the frames shook. Sarah spent the night pacing, keeping the fire alive, listening for the sound of hooves that never came. Every few minutes she went to the window, staring into the white blur outside, whispering a silent prayer. When dawn finally broke, the world outside was buried under a sheet of snow. The fences had vanished, the path to the barn invisible. She didn't wait. Wrapping herself in a thick coat, she tied a scarf around her head and stepped into the cold. The air stung her face, and her boots sank deep with every step, but she kept moving toward the barn, calling his name. No answer, only wind. She found the horse first, tired, half frozen, but alive. It was tied loosely near the fence, its breath fogging in the cold air. That meant he couldn't be far. Panic rose in her chest as she scanned the open field. Then in the distance she saw a shape half buried in snow. She ran. When she reached him, he was lying beside a fallen fence post, his hat lost, his hands raw from the cold. He was breathing barely. She dropped to her knees, brushing snow from his face. "John," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open for a moment, just long enough to recognize her. "Sarah," he murmured, his lips pale. You shouldn't be out here." "Neither should you," she said, wrapping the blanket from her sack around his shoulders. "Come on, we're going home." It took every ounce of strength she had to pull him onto the horse and lead them back through the snow. Her legs trembled, her fingers burned, but she didn't stop. When they finally reached the house, she dragged him inside, shut the door against the wind, and worked through the night to warm him. She lit every fire she could, boiled water, and pressed warm cloths against his hands. Hours passed before he stirred again. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "You should have left me." She shook her head. "That's not how this works." For a long time he said nothing. He just watched her, the woman he had once seen as a burden, now standing in front of him with a strength that shamed him. In that silence, something inside him cracked open. The walls he'd built for years, the pride that had kept him alone, all of it began to crumble. Days later, when he was strong enough to walk, he joined her by the fire. She was mending one of his coats again, her head bent over her sewing. "You saved my life," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "You would have done the same," he smiled faintly. "Maybe. But I doubt I'd have made it back without you." Sarah paused, meeting his gaze for the first time. "You'd have done fine," she said softly. "You're stubborn enough to outlive the cold." He laughed, really laughed, and the sound surprised them both. It was rough and low, like a sound that had been forgotten. She smiled, and the room seemed to warm a little more. After that, something changed between them, not in words but in the way they moved around each other. He started asking her opinion, small things at first, like which seeds to plant or how to mend a broken hinge. He began leaving his hat by the door instead of tossing it on the chair. She started joining him outside more often, walking beside him as he checked the fences, her scarf trailing in the wind. One afternoon, as they stood by the corral watching the horses, he turned to her. "You ever think about leaving?" She shook her head. "No, there's nowhere I'd rather be." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, really looked, and something in his chest tightened, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He reached for her hand, rough against her smooth skin. She didn't pull away. For a long moment they stood there in silence, surrounded by open land and the fading light. From that day forward, John found himself seeing the ranch differently. The fences didn't just mark his land anymore, they marked the place they had built together. When he worked, he thought of her. When he came home, he listened for her footsteps. The loneliness that had once filled every corner of his life was gone, replaced by something he still didn't have a name for. The town kept talking, as towns always do. But the whispers changed. They said the old maid had done what no one else could, tamed the proud rancher, softened his heart, and turned his house into a home. John never cared for talk, but when he caught those words he didn't deny them. He'd only glance at Sarah, smile quietly, and go back to his work. In his eyes, she hadn't just saved his life that winter. She had saved the part of him that had been frozen long before the storm ever came. Spring returned to the valley with slow grace. The snow melted into rivers that carried the scent of new grass, and the fields shimmered under the first warm sun. The ranch came alive again, calves were born, wildflowers bloomed near the fence lines, and the air buzzed with quiet renewal. John stood on the porch one morning, watching the world turn green again, and for the first time in years, the silence around him didn't feel empty. It felt full of life, full of peace, full of her. Inside, Sarah moved through the house as if she'd always belonged there. Her hands seemed to bring order wherever they went. She tended to the small things, polishing the wood that had gone dull, replanting flowers that hadn't survived the frost, stitching new curtains from old cloth. Her presence had become as natural to the place as the wind that brushed through the trees. John couldn't remember how the house had felt before her laughter began to fill it, soft and rare but steady, like the song of a bird that returns each morning without fail. He often caught himself watching her without meaning to. The way she smiled faintly while kneading bread, or how she paused to look out at the hills before starting her chores. There was no pretense to her. She didn't try to be someone she wasn't. She simply existed in quiet truth, and that truth drew him in more deeply than any beauty he'd ever known. Some days they worked side by side without saying much. They didn't need to. The air between them was easy now, carrying a kind of unspoken companionship. When they rode out to mend fences or move cattle, their movements matched naturally, like two parts of the same rhythm. Sometimes he'd offer her his hand to help her down from the wagon, and she'd take it without hesitation. Those small moments, those brief touches, spoke louder than any words they could have said. But the town hadn't stopped watching. People noticed the change in him, how his one sharp tone had softened, how his temper seemed to have gone quiet. They saw the way he looked at her, the way his eyes followed her with respect instead of impatience. Soon the whispers shifted again, this time with surprise. They said the old maid had somehow captured the proud rancher's heart. John never cared much for gossip, but one day, as he rode into town for supplies, an older man outside the general store chuckled and said, "Heard your wife's running that ranch better than you ever did." John didn't argue. He just smiled faintly, tipped his hat, and replied, "You might be right." The man blinked, not expecting that answer, but John simply turned and went about his business. There was no shame in his voice, no trace of the pride that once ruled him, only quiet truth. That evening when he returned home, Sarah was sitting by the fire, her sewing in her lap. The light flickered across her face, and he paused at the door, just watching. For years, this house had been a place of labor, a roof over his head, a space to sleep between days of endless work. Now it was something more. He set his hat down and sat beside her. "The town's got new stories about us," he said with a half-smile. She looked up, her brow lifting slightly. "Do I want to know? Probably not," he said, leaning back. "But they're better than the old ones," she smiled, shaking her head softly. "Let them talk, they always will." "Doesn't bother you." "It used to," she admitted. "But I've learned that people only see what they want. Let them talk about us, they don't know what's real." He studied her face for a long moment. "And what is real, Sarah?" She looked at him then, really looked, and her voice was calm when she said, "This. The work, the quiet, the way we get up every morning and start again." He nodded, unable to find his words. In that moment he realized she was right. Their life wasn't a story for others to tell. It wasn't dramatic or grand. It was built from small things, meals shared, fences fixed, hands brushed, storms weathered. And somewhere along the way, those small things had turned into love. As the months passed, that love grew quietly, rooted in trust and time. John found himself telling her stories from his youth, things he'd never spoken aloud before. He told her about the first horse he'd ever broken, about the brother he'd lost when he was 16, about the loneliness he'd carried without ever naming it. She listened, never interrupting, her eyes steady and kind. When he ran out of words, she'd just reach across the table and rest her hand over his. That simple gesture said everything. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills, John brought her outside to the porch. The sky burned gold and pink, and the ranch stretched out before them like an endless promise. "I used to think this land was all I'd ever need," he said quietly. "Turns out I was missing half of it." She looked out across the fields, the breeze catching her hair. "You didn't need me, John," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, I didn't need you, but I wanted you, and that's different." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was deep, full, alive. She didn't reply, but her eyes glistened as she leaned her head against his shoulder. The two of them stood there as the day faded into night, the stars rising one by one above the wide land that had seen so much of their story unfold. After that evening, life carried on much the same, but everything felt richer, steadier. When John rode out across the fields, he knew she'd be waiting. When she heard his horse returning, she always had the lamp lit in the window. The town stopped calling her the old maid. They started calling her Mrs. Mercer, the woman who had tamed the storm. And though she never asked for recognition, she'd smile quietly whenever someone mentioned her name beside his. John still worked the land, but his heart no longer belonged only to it. It belonged to her, to the woman who had walked into his life with calm strength, who had turned duty into devotion, who had shown him that love doesn't always arrive with thunder or flame. Sometimes it comes softly, like sunlight melting the last of the snow, until you can't tell when the cold ended and the warmth began.